I'm Ray Sanchez Mayers.
And I'm Elsa Candelario. We're pleased to welcome you to this Hispanic Heritage Month event.
This event is sponsored by the Rutgers School of Social Work and the LISTA Certificate Program. LISTA stands for Latino Latina Initiatives for Service, Training, and Assessment. Our mission is to train social workers to be able to work with Hispanic populations in a culturally sensitive, culturally competent manner.
Hispanic Heritage Month has been instituted in the U.S. since 1989, and it's a time to celebrate the contributions of Latinos to American society.
Now we'd like to welcome the president of Rutgers University, Dr. Jonathan Holloway.
My scholarship centers on the long struggle of African Americans to gain full citizenship in this country. And I know that for Latinos and Latinas, that struggle is just as real. And it is during these struggles that celebrations of heritage and culture and values take on added meaning. Look, I'm the newcomer, so I'm still learning, but it's gratifying to hear about efforts like the Latino New Jersey History Project run by faculty and students in the School of Arts and Sciences in New Brunswick, the Center for Latino Arts and Culture, a whole range of student clubs, organizations, and interest groups focused on Hispanic heritage. And these programs are incredibly valuable, and I really can't wait to actually see these programs in action. I'm also proud to support the LISTA program through which Rutgers expands the pool of social workers who have the cultural competency to work effectively in Hispanic communities and meet people where they are. You've heard me speak before about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. At least I hope you have. I believe Rutgers needs to be intentional about its commitment to these issues. We know from our internal equity audit that there is much more work to do in increasing the diversity of our faculty to match the diversity of our student body, just to start in one place. This is certainly a matter of equity, but it's also a matter of perspective. We gain so much from bringing together the ideas and viewpoints of people who come from different backgrounds, heritages, and lived experiences. I want Rutgers to be a leader, a national leader, in our pursuit of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to thank the School of Social Work for its commitment to these values. I want to thank all of you as well. I know this will be a very rewarding morning, and I'm so happy to welcome all of you to it. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, President Holloway, for being with us today. We hope to see you again soon at the School of Social Work.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce to you the Dean of the School of Social Work, Dr. Cathryn Potter, without whom LISTA would not be possible. Dean Potter.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Cathryn Potter, Dean of the School of Social Work. I'm looking at the participants here today, and I want to welcome students, faculty, alumni, and this distinguished panel to the School of Social Work celebration. Today we have an opportunity to celebrate Latinx contributions and leadership in our society in general, and to learn from leaders in our profession, and to highlight their work in local, state, and national contexts, to really focus ourselves on learning from them and considering applications to each of our personal and work networks. It's really exciting to be here today, and I'm glad that you're all here. I want to offer tremendous gratitude to Professors Ray Sanchez Mayers, who's a longtime faculty member here in the School of Social Work, and we might consider him the father of LISTA. It was his brainchild, and he brought it to fruition. And to Elsa Candelaria, who joined our faculty in July, for their organization of this event. And I want to thank this distinguished panel for making time to be with us today and to lead us in a really focused learning event. So welcome, and I'll hand it back to Ray, I think. Oh, and I also love the music. I was watching people's pictures, and I think we were all trying not to dance, but not really succeeding.
Thank you, Dean Potter, for those remarks and for your leadership in promoting diversity and inclusion in the School of Social Work. She has been very supportive of LISTA from the beginning, as I said. Now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Juan Gonzalez. He's a journalist and professor of communications and public policy, as well as a professor of professional practice in journalism and media studies. He's an award-winning broadcast journalist and investigative reporter. He's a co-host of Democracy Now!, author of Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, and a founder of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. He spent many years as a columnist for the New York Daily News, and he's been a general reporter and columnist in newspapers, radio, and television. His book, Harvest of Empire, as I mentioned, is a very well-known and used book. It's a required text in many courses in college. And it's a required course at the School of Social. It's a required book at the School of Social Work in one of our Latinos courses. Before beginning his career in journalism, he spent several years as a Latino community and civil rights activist, helping to found and lead two national organizations, the Young Lords Party during the late 1960s and the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights during the late 1970s. Welcome, Professor Gonzalez, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Ray. My greetings to President Holloway and the Dean, and I'm pleased to be here.
Good. Okay, I'm going to start with some questions. We're going to have questions for each one of our speakers, and then we will open it up if anybody has any questions, or you can leave a question in the chat room and we can pick it up there. Okay, so my first question is, with your years of experience as a grassroots activist, what has encouraged you not to give up and continue to persevere in the face of daunting opposition?
Well, Ray, as over 50 years now, as both a social activist and a journalist, I've been able to witness, as many of you have, the enormous advancements of our society has made in technology, communications, health, consumer production. Yet I've been continually outraged by the deepening inequality in who benefits from such advances. That sense of outrage is really what powers me, what gives me energy. In addition, I've been deeply inspired because each new generation of young people seems determined as they gain consciousness to achieve a more just world and to fashion new creative methods of social protest and refusing to give in. I think, the older we get, the more things we acquire, the more willing we become to accept the status quo. And so we need this constant jolt of younger people who refuse to accept the status quo and who seek to change society for the better. And that's what the best example, of course, in the Latinx community are the dreamers. About 700,000 now young Latinos who've gotten temporary status, but who are constantly in a precarious existence through no fault of their own, brought here illegally by their parents, undocumented, and then grew up here in the United States. So I think that the fate of the dreamers is really, it not only gives you the inspiration of the young people, but also the sense of what can be in the Latino or Latinx community.
Okay, I have another question for you about your book, Harvest of Empire. I know you're working on a third edition of this book. We're really looking forward to seeing it. Since the last edition of the book in 2011, what are some of the major changes that have occurred in Hispanic communities around the country since your last revision?
Well, there's been quite a few. I would say, I would boil it down to three. First has been the constant transformation in both the size and the diversity of the Latino community in the United States. We're talking now more than 60 million people, about 64 if you include the 3.2 million in Puerto Rico, which the Census Bureau does it as part of the regular United States. But I think the most interesting thing is the diversity. For instance, I believe that the new census will show for the first time that the Salvadoran migrant community and the Dominican community will surpass Cubans as the third and fourth largest Hispanic migrant group, obviously after Mexicans and Puerto Ricans. So this is going to be something dramatically new. And also the growth of the population it has now spread to virtually every town in the United States. And in fact, the Latino community has moved faster than any immigrant group in American history out of the big cities and into small town America. So wherever you go in the United States now, even in the smallest towns and rural areas, there are sizable Latino populations. And of course, with the growth of the population, has come a larger proportion of educated and professional Latinos, a sector that 20, 30, 40 years ago only existed in small numbers. So that's the first thing, the diversity of the community. Second is immigration has obviously become a central national issue over the past 10 years. My last edition of Harvest came out in 2011, but especially during the Trump era. And we're not just talking about undocumented immigration. We've seen the barbaric attempts of our federal government to imprison and separate children from their parents. We've seen the move by the Trump administration to reduce dramatically refugee and asylum admissions into the United States. By 2020, I think the federal government had reduced the annual cap on refugee resettlement from 110,000, which was under the last year of the Obama administration, to a mere 18,000 in 2020. And we've seen now the situation where the federal government spends more money on immigration enforcement, about $18 billion than it does on all 5 main federal enforcement agencies: the FBI, the DEA, the Secret Service, the Marshal Service, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. So basically, more money is spent on immigration enforcement than on all the other federal enforcement agencies of the government. This is a dramatic growth in the new immigration industrial complex. So that's a major change that has occurred. It's especially been ramped up. And finally, the enormous changes that have occurred in Puerto Rico, the last remaining colony of the United States. For the last 4 years, for the first time in history, we've seen virtually nonstop coverage of the crises in Puerto Rico. First, there was the debt crisis of 2015, the Congress imposing a financial control board over the island. Then came Hurricane Maria in 2017 with 3,000 lives lost, a completely botched federal response to that tragedy. Who could forget President Trump throwing paper towels to some of the residents of San Juan when he went there for a few hours to visit? Then the massive corruption of the rebuilding, and finally a government that was so inept that it led in 2019 to the first ever massive protests in the streets of San Juan and other parts of Puerto Rico that forced the resignation. For the first time in US or Puerto Rican history, a governor was forced out of office by popular protest. So all these things have happened just in the last 5 years in Puerto Rico. So I think those are some of the major changes that I'm getting into in the new book, and in addition to the political changes, which I think you may be asking me about, but those are some of the big ticket items that have occurred over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, and also the constant migration.
Yes,
from
well,
the island to the mainland now.
Led to about 200,000 people fleeing from the island, largely to Central Florida, and that's going to have a big impact on the situation, the political situation in Florida in coming years.
Yes, that's true. What do you see as some of the major challenges facing Latino communities today?
Well, I think like the rest of the United States, the principal immediate challenge is overcoming the COVID pandemic. We've seen all the reports of the disproportionate illnesses and deaths in the Latino and African American community. Latinos are being hospitalized from the virus at 4 times the rate of white American, and especially in terms of children. We just saw the CDC report that says 45% of all the children who have died of COVID-19 were Latino, 29% were African American. That means over 70% of all the child deaths from COVID-19 have been in the African American and Latino community. That's an astonishing number, and it shows that the impact that COVID is having on the general Latino community. Of course, you put that together with the lack of adequate health care. Nearly 18% of Latinos do not have health insurance compared to 6% of non-Hispanic whites. And the growth of the education gap as a result of all the shutdowns of the schools, and with so many Latinx parents and children not having access to broadband, the remote learning has been a disaster, I think, in the Latino community. And so you have all this combination of stuff that's related to COVID. And of course, the economic crisis of unemployment. Many Latinos work in quote essential jobs, but they are in essential jobs that don't often provide proper social distancing or protective equipment in the meat packing plants of the Midwest, for instance, the chicken processing plants of the South and the Southeast, so that you have the unemployment crisis together with the health crisis. These are the main problems, I think, that are affecting the Latinx community right now.
Yes. We know that Hispanics are forecast to be nearly 30% of the population by the year 2050, and that they make up a large part of the population in many areas of the country now. Do you foresee that they'll become a political bloc, and how do you foresee that their political power will increase, if at all? I know you mentioned Florida, and how that's going to change some of the dynamics there politically. And so what do you foresee?
Well, first of all, I think, again, because of the astonishing growth of the population, there's also been an astonishing growth in the numbers of Latinos voting in presidential and in non-presidential elections. For instance, back in 1976, there were about 2.1 million Hispanics that reported voting to the Census Bureau. By 2016, 50 years later, there was 12.6 million. That's a 500% jump in the 50 years. Whereas in the non-Hispanic white population, there's only been a 27% increase. So 500% compared to 27%. And in the African-American community, there's been a sharp increase, but not nearly at the level of the Latino community, about 137% increase in 50 years in the numbers of people voting. So that's a dramatic change. In just the 8 years between the election of Barack Obama in 2008 and the victory of Donald Trump in 2016, 3 million more Latinos reported voting. And I think what's most noteworthy is the non-presidential elections, right? Because the presidential elections get a lot of attention, but the off-year elections in 2018, 11.7 million Latinos voted. That's nearly double the number that voted in 2014, the previous midterm elections. That's an astonishing growth in participation in an election that did not have a presidential ticket at the top of the ticket. So that shows that that there's been a remarkable growth of the Latino electorate in just the last few years. And here's one little statistic that might be of interest to you. More than 3 million US citizen Latinos have turned 18 just since Donald Trump was elected in 2016. 3 million more US citizen Latinos have turned 18 and therefore are eligible to vote just since Trump was elected in 2016. So that shows you the continued growth of the Latino vote. And we're seeing record numbers elected, not just in Congress and the Senate, but the city councils, sheriff's offices, boards of education, county commissioners, a huge change. Now, that said, Latinos will never be the same as a unified voting bloc as other ethnic or racial groups, as African Americans, for instance, or in the Jewish community or others, because it's a very diverse population. You mentioned Florida. Well, South Florida is populated largely by Cubans and Venezuelans and Nicaraguans who are much more conservative, many of them having come as refugees from social revolutions in their own countries, whereas Central Florida is overwhelmingly populated by Puerto Ricans and Dominicans who tend to be much more progressive and democratic or liberal in their views, so that what the Puerto Rican and Dominican vote in Central Florida is doing largely, it has been doing for the last few years, is offsetting the Cuban and Venezuelan and Nicaraguan vote of South Florida. The only difference is that the Cuban community is growing gradually older and older, whereas the Puerto Rican and Dominican community is much younger. So it all depends on where in the country you are. It's not as monolithic a block, but it's definitely a growing and influential block.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in this election, for sure.
And I think that the migration issue, the immigration issue, has is almost like the definition of the Trump campaign is the wall that he promised to build and promised, let's not forget, to have Mexico pay for it, but that the wall has become symbolic not just to Latinos in the U.S., but to Latin America, of the disconnect between our government and the situation in the rest of the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you, Juan. I'd like to see if anybody has any questions. Would anybody like to ask Juan a question? No questions, huh? Oh, here.
We have one question in the chat.
Yes.
The question is from Marianne. The field of communication is so critical to systemic social change. What kind of collaborations do you see between social work and communication?
Well, increasingly, obviously, as a journalist who always was used to producing the news, this new world in which we live in which virtually every person is a multimedia cub reporter, just through their own phone, has really democratized the flow of information at the same time that it has lowered the quality of the kind of information that people receive. So I think that one of the things we have to understand is that the technological revolution in mass communications is really breathtaking in how quickly it's changing, so that we now have Facebook being the most powerful media company in the world, right? Without a doubt, there's no one even close. And so the reality of how any of us, whether it's in social work or in traditional journalism or in science and math, communicate knowledge and information has become really something that everyone has to tackle with, because everyone is, in essence, a producer of media today, or has the potential to be a producer of media. So I think that media literacy has to become part of any profession these days, because you can't wait for the press or the journalists to report the news. You have to be able to, as soon as you have stuff that you think is valuable or important, have the skills to be able to get it out to masses of people.
Thank you for that question. Do we have any other questions? No, chat. Oh, here's one. Great question. Okay, I'm going to, Juan, thank you very much. We appreciate you coming today and taking your time, and we'd like to have you back to the School of Social Work again to be able to discuss some of these issues in greater detail.
Okay, my pleasure. And I'll try to stay and listen to some of the other presentations.
Thank you.
And I think we just want to remind everyone that we're going to have time at the very end for questions as well. So hopefully you'll stick around for that.
Okay, next, our next speaker is Drolanda Padilla. She couldn't be with us here today, but she sent us a short video discussing the importance of Hispanic Heritage Month for social work and for social workers. So first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Dr. Padilla. She's a professor of social work and women's studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And she's a director of the Center for Diversity and Social and Economic Justice, which is a center of the Council on Social Work Education. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare, and currently serves as vice president of the Society for Social Work and Research. Her research investigates racial and ethnic disparities in health and well-being in the United States, particularly among Latino populations. Her research examines the consequences of poverty for Latino children and families with a focus on health and development in early childhood. So we're very happy to hear these remarks from Dr. Padilla.
Thank you for inviting me to be a part of the Hispanic Heritage Month celebration of the Rutgers School of Social Work. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Drolanda Padilla, and I'm a professor at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work at the University of Texas at Austin. And I also direct the Center for Diversity and Social and Economic Justice, which is a center of the Council on Social Work Education. As we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, as social workers, we think about the place of Latino heritage in social work education. I think that many of us Latino scholars can pinpoint the first time when we encountered images of our heritage that didn't match our lived experiences. For me, it was my first semester in my community college. And in a way, right there, my whole academic agenda was laid out for me. I decided to write a paper for my English class, which I titled The Assimilation of Mexican American Youth. I look back, and while it's a wonder that I even knew words like assimilation, I was part of a rich and prideful Mexican American culture that had taught me many things. And I had what I tell my students is the most important tool for critical thinking: personal lived experience from which to draw upon. As I started to pull books down from our library shelves for my paper, I saw in disbelief what was written about my community in books like William Madson's The Mexican Americans of South Texas, a case study in cultural anthropology, and Celia Heller's sociological study, New Converts to the American Dream. Those images were so wrong and absurd. They were almost tragic comical and revealed a seriously flawed scholarship. All of us have seen these characterizations of Latinos, things like fatalism, for example. There is a difference between fatalism and knowing how to reconcile with life and move forward with a sense of hope. So I changed the title of my paper to Perspectives on the Problems of Assimilation of Mexican American Youth, and made it a critical analysis. Heritage is no small thing. Jose Armas, in one of the books I cited in my paper, La Familia de la Raza, talks about Mexican American families containing, quote, the basic elements of direction and foundation for a truly human way of life. So what it means for social work education to speak to Latino heritage is then fundamental. It's about teaching social work practice that is responsive and grounded in the lived experiences of the Latino communities and who they are. When we don't know much about their lives, we don't know how to frame what we say to them or how to work with them. Heritage is no small thing. Any social work practice that is not responsive to the communities we serve will not only be ineffective, but it will cause harm. As Latinos, or as people deeply engaged in Latino communities, we have a very clear sense of what it means to be authentic about the lived experiences of communities. We have a lens that allows us to see deeply and to take in the lives of people. That lens can guide how we shape the social work discipline and profession, how we develop our curriculum, what it takes to create equitable learning environments, and how we conduct and use research. In terms of the first aspect, curriculum, our heritage suggests to us that how we teach makes a difference. We can't just give students information about people's lived experiences. We use stories and provide opportunities for students to discover for themselves and engage in the culture of communities. We provide mirrors where students can see reflections of themselves and windows through which they can see the realities of others. One of the most powerful ways to do this is through books. I created a library on diversity and justice in the Diversity Center website. It contains a collection that I curate and that I keep up to date of about 250 contemporary books. It contains narrative nonfiction, including memoirs and ethnographies, fiction, including literary novels, science fiction, and graphic novels, and social analysis books by and about social activists. I use this collection in my own teaching. Students select the books that they want to read. As one of the major proponents of using literature to teach about social issues, Louise Rosenblatt convincingly shows that beyond teaching facts, literature is a source, quote, literature is a source of insight and emotional liberation. And this is supported by education research. Another pedagogical approach to provide opportunities for students to discover for themselves and engage in the cultures of communities is the use of models. For example, I was moved by a seminar on self-care that Dr. Guia Apostle from Stockton University here in New Jersey gave recently to social workers working in the context of COVID in her native country of the Philippines. I thought it would be a powerful way to show students what culturally grounded practices sound and look like in action. So I invited her to create an abridged version of the seminar for the educator resource that I produced this month and which is up currently on the Diversity Center website. In the webinar, although using teaching standard self-care skills, Dr. Guia Apostle frames the approaches she uses from a Filipino cultural perspective. The self-care skills she chooses align with Filipino culture. Participants are encouraged to draw on their own cultural philosophies when they need to. A mantra, a proverb, a belief, a code, or a prayer to cling to. Indigenous languages are interspersed, providing a source of validation for participants. The webinar resonated with me as a Latina, and I could see how it could do the same for people of other Filipino cultural heritages. Creating equitable learning environments is a second way that we can hold true to our heritage We know that we need to be intentional about this. It doesn't just happen. In order, for example, to build a faculty that is capable of actually serving the needs of Latinos, we need to rewrite our job descriptions, change our expectations for what cover letters should say, and create new interviewing rating forms when we are interviewing candidates. They all need to center on ways that potential faculty demonstrate their specific strategies and intentions to advance Latino student success. Finally, holding true to our heritage involves research. I have done research on the unexpected healthy birth outcomes, specifically birth weight and infant mortality, of Mexican American immigrant women, which are on par with non-Hispanic white mothers. The research shows that in part, the reason for these healthier outcomes are the healthy behaviors of Mexican American immigrant pregnant women in terms of good nutrition, low drug and alcohol tobacco use, access to family support, and high rates of breastfeeding. By the third generation, however, birth outcomes deteriorate significantly. So I, along with a team of researchers, conducted a systematic review to see if health providers acknowledged and supported these healthy behaviors in Mexican immigrant mothers. We found that for the most part, they did not, and evidently were not aware of this critical health research. So not only did they not encourage the healthy behaviors in first generation mothers, they did not work with second generation mothers, given that the risk for poor health outcomes were had become significantly higher. This tells us that we need to be vigilant of the sources that we use to teach about practice to our students. Are they based on rigorous current research? Social work curriculum, learning environments, and research shape our interventions. They cannot be divorced from the lived experiences of the communities we serve. And not only the social and economic conditions, but the cultural context, the world views which provide a lens through which they see life. Heritage is no small thing. Heritage is people's most precious legacy. Quoting Jose Arce again, it contains the basic elements of direction and foundation for a truly human way of life.
Thank you, Dr. Padilla. I wish she could have been here to answer some questions for us, but I think she made some very important points. The importance of understanding culture, using the example of those immigrant mothers, the importance of heritage as our most precious legacy. She mentioned the Council on Social Work Education's website, and they have a lot of resources there, not just for social work educators, but actually for social workers as well. And the last thing, as an aside, I have to say, I was surprised, but she mentioned Guia Apostle, a professor at Stockton. Guia Apostle was a student of mine many years ago in my research courses in Camden. And now she's a professor. So I'm glad to hear that she's done well as well. Okay, now Elsa Candelario is going to introduce our next speaker.
Hello. Thank you for being with us today. I'm Elsa Candelaria. I'm a professor of professional practice here at Rutgers School of Social Work. Welcome to all. I have the pleasure of introducing Joanna Galle. who is the Senior Policy Advisor at the Office of New Americans at the New Jersey Department of Human Services. Joanna works on identifying, developing, and executing policies and strategies to advance efforts to welcome and empower immigrant communities in the state of New Jersey. Prior to joining the department, Joanna served as the executive director of the New Jersey Alliance for Immigrant Justice. And in that role, she played a key role in helping to pass the legislation to expand access to driver licenses to all in the implementation of Attorney General Gruel's Immigrant Trust Directive, which we hope will soon be rolled out. It's expected to be rolled out in January. Joanna's professional experience also includes working the National American Civil Liberties Union and participating in the ACLU of Northern California's Miaclu campaign, visiting various affiliates fighting for immigrant rights. Ms. Calle is a longtime New Jersey resident, born in Ecuador and raised in Hackensack. She has lived experience as a formerly undocumented student with undocumented family members. She has earned a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Political Science from TCNJ and a Master's in Criminal Justice from Rutgers University. Welcome, Joanna. It's good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Particularly seeing you in your new role. I'm very excited to have you here with us. I have to say that I was super excited to find that the Office of New Americans is a new initiative that was started in 2019 by Governor Murphy. It was a long time in coming. The governor's Blue Ribbon Panel on Immigrant Integration of 2008 recommended that this office be instituted. So it's good to see that it's finally been instituted. Can you speak a little bit about the work that the Office of New Americans does and your role as the Senior Policy Advisor?
Yeah, sure. So, and thanks so much for having me. A lot of what you just said about, developing, identifying, and executing policies and strategies that advance and welcome and empower immigrant communities here in our state really is sort of the quick and dirty version of what I do. In terms of the specifics, I came on board in April. The office, Governor Murphy has always prioritized really ensuring that every New Jerseyan is welcome in their state, regardless of where they came from, regardless of how long they've been here, and regardless of their immigration status. And we understand, obviously, here in New Jersey that building a stronger and fairer New Jersey really builds upon making sure that every one of our residents is being supported. So the office has really been tasked with making sure that we are providing accessibility to services, that folks understand their rights and they're getting the appropriate training and the resources that are available from the state. Also ensuring that we're building partnerships with our stakeholders, organizations, service providers, advocates, organizers, and really ensuring that the voices of those who are impacted are included in a lot of the efforts that we're putting together. And also making sure that we're building trust with the community and ensuring that, when we're talking about accessibility, we're talking about everything, not just public services, but employment, making sure that the information we're putting out there is in the language that our community understands. And so, as I was saying, I started in April and obviously COVID hit. And so a lot of the work that has been involved in my tenure here so far has really been ensuring that our community has accessibility to the resources they need as they are trying to get through this pandemic like everyone else, given that obviously we understand that our community really has been the most impacted, one of the most impacted due to COVID. And so it really has been trying to ensure that they are all very aware of the resources that are available to them during this time.
Thank you for that. Well, you have your work cut out for you, especially coordinating across all state departments to make sure that the rights of immigrants are in place. As a proud former dreamer yourself, you work with and mentor at-risk youth, especially immigrant youth. Can you share some of the personal experiences that motivated you to work in this capacity with Latino communities?
Yeah, so obviously I was personally impacted, and having lived a lived experience of being undocumented, not having access to resources, not having additional support to understand and support my perspective of what I was going through, really, I think it impacted a lot of why I felt this was important to do. Um, Growing up, I didn't really have we didn't have the term dreamer. We didn't have in-state tuition. This was before Governor Murphy signed financial aid for undocumented students. I mean, all these things did not exist when I was a dreamer almost 20 years ago. And my family obviously needed support. None of us knew what to do when it came to applying for college or how to navigate the world that we were dealing with. And so having gone through that uncertainty, having gone through that heartache, not really knowing what to do, I found an advocacy organization at the time that gave me some information about my rights as an undocumented student, but I realized really that wasn't something that was common knowledge. And so I navigated as I could with the support that I could find, advocated for myself as much as I could. And then after I graduated from college, some of my former educators actually in the town that I grew up in asked me to come in and start talking to some of the undocumented students, because so many of them were dealing with academic and emotional struggles because of what they were dealing with. So many of their families feeling hopeless because they didn't know if they were going to be able to go to college, feeling hopeless that their kids were struggling because they didn't know what to do, which was very similar to me coming home feeling lost after not knowing whether I was going to be able to go to college, and my parents not knowing what to do in terms of helping me, right? Like, you have parents who don't speak the language, don't understand the system, can't navigate what's going on top of their own fear for their immigration status. And so that really became, for me, the reason why it felt so important to really get involved and mentor and support and provide a little bit of hope, but also provide a bit of guidance. And so I spent a lot of time talking to parents about the process of navigating what the higher education process would look like for their kids, helping them with college applications, explaining what the process looks like, and then helping students go through their own process as they're applying to college and navigating all that. I think it's the least I can do is to come back and sort of share the knowledge that I had, and making sure that other families didn't have to struggle the way some of us had to at the very beginning.
Thank you for sharing your experience and for sharing the insights of someone who's had that lived experience. And as a trusted broker, it's so important for you to be involved with this community. I'm sure that they appreciate it. Why is policy analysis and legislative education important for our social workers'
So
involvement?
yeah, I think we're all sometimes politics and policy can be really daunting, and so we tend to want to just kind of click off and just assume that it's going to be handled somewhere else. But the fact is that policies and laws have impact in the lives of people every single day in everything that's going on around us, right? What resources are available to the communities that you're serving? Who has access to those resources? Where are those resources meeting the needs of the community? It's all determined by policy and the legislative process. So knowing what is and isn't available is key to ensuring that the people that we're all supporting have the right information, that we understand that, and that the policymakers understand what the needs are. Many policymakers rely on service providers and grassroots organizations to inform policy decisions. So those folks who are impacted on the ground, and those of you that are working with them, really are a key to ensuring that the resources and policy decisions are going in the right track, and also to help identify gaps, right? Like understanding where the gaps are for the community. Those who are impacted really are such a huge part of deciding how we put our resources and what we prioritize. And they deserve to have a voice in the process. They deserve to be involved in what we do. And that's where social work really is, to empower people, to empower folks to share their concerns, to empower folks to feel comfortable stepping forward and feeling comfortable advocating for themselves. That's where your supporting of impacting people could lead to policy change and could actually lead to structural changes that are so much needed.
Thank you for sharing that, Joanna. You have been quite the advocate and a very, very effective organizer with uh, quite a few accomplishments. Can you tell us a little bit about the policy issues that you've worked on that are important for the Latino community, and what ingredients made the work successful?
Yeah, so in my prior role, as you mentioned, I worked for a large network of organizations that really worked on various policy campaigns, including the driver's licenses campaign. And I'm really proud of the work we all did in doing that. And the success was really the diversity of the stakeholders who were involved. It wasn't just Latinx immigrants or undocumented folks who were fighting for this. By the time the campaign won, I mean, it took 5 years from the time I was there, but there were others who were working even harder for longer. Um, we saw the campaign and the conversation change because the campaign was broad and it impacted so many others. So you had impacted community members, you had college students, you had US citizens that were not directly impacted by the issue. You had Black brothers and sisters who were also interested in fighting for a racial and social justice issue, new allies and new advocates from all walks of life who were there to ensure basically that the policy passed because it mattered and it was important to a particular community. So I think building broad partnership beyond the Latinx community really made a big difference because it was powering numbers. So that's one thing that I thought was important. Um, the other really is to have the voices of people who are impacted front and center and ensuring that what we are doing, what we're fighting for directly works for those who are impacted, and that they were regularly understanding exactly what the campaign looked like and how we were going to get there. I don't think, many of us obviously are very dedicated for our communities and want to do the work that we do, but I don't think we would have been able to hang on for as long as we did had we not had impacted people side by side with us, reminding us why this was so important, why it was so needed all along. I think that really made a big difference. And in terms of my current role here at the ONA, this prior experience really impacts what I do now because it's just important to ensure that resources and policies are reflective of the need of the community, that we build partnership with diverse stakeholders, that we ensure that the community is really is a priority on all the efforts that we put together. And so, as I mentioned before about making sure that we understand what the needs are, having that sort of pulse and that touch on the pulse of what folks are dealing with really impacts what we do. And it's so important, right? Like I've been looking at data and we unfortunately, we see it. Those of us who've been on the ground before, we see the need and we know, but data is helpful because then I in my role at the ONA, I have data to show what I know is happening on the ground, right? We have the third largest foreign-born population in the nation. We have the fifth largest undocumented population in the nation here in the state of New Jersey. 36.2% of the foreign-born people in the state of New Jersey speak Spanish, right? And so for us to have all that information and know that I carry with me my experiences of building campaigns and fighting with so many folks in the work that we do here at the ONA, because it's basically the same formula of ensuring that people are getting the resources and the needs met through everything that we do.
And lastly, are there policy issues that are on the horizon that our students should be involved with?
So I will say, as I mentioned before about, ensuring that you're working with folks on the ground, I think that connecting with research service providers, with activists, grassroots organizations, service provisions on the ground is probably the better way to know what a priority is for people, right? And what people really need. I would connect with ongoing advocacy campaigns that are happening now. There are many that are fighting for racial justice and equity for our communities. So I would say, I don't know that I'm in a place to say like, this is the fight, because I am now with ONA and I'm sure that folks on the ground are probably better place to tell you that. However, from our position here at the state and with the governor and his administration, we understand that policies and in our community is in fact a priority. And so expanding resources for folks during this crisis has been a major need. And we worked on expanding rental assistance. We worked on childcare and tuition subsidies. So if folks, for all of you who are aware, go, I think it's childcare.nj.gov, just find information about childcare, because right now there are subsidies for many folks in our communities that are struggling because their kids are home due to virtual learning, right? Making sure that they understand that those resources are available to them. I've come a long way as a dreamer, obviously, and New Jersey has come a long way since I was a dreamer. These laws that exist right now did not exist when I was a student. And so to really see how important it is, Governor Murphy just signed the budget almost 2 weeks, last week actually. And in the budget, they doubled the resources that we have available now for legal representation for folks who are currently fighting detention and deportation. That did not exist 2 decades ago when I was undocumented, right? As you mentioned, Attorney General Grewal has been implementing policies that detangle the relationship between police and enforcement law, immigration law enforcement, right? And he's been, Attorney General Grewal has been in court fighting all these policies that we heard from Juan Gonzalez about what's going on from the federal government. Every state has had to step up and do something to ensure that we lend our voices in the fight. And Attorney General Grewal has been fighting on every one of those things, pushing back, even litigating on DACA, just to make sure that the voices of the New Jerseyans that are impacted are being a part of those fights at the federal government, that we don't allow the federal government to discriminate against our communities, which is what we know has been happening for a long time. And something that would be really interesting for all of you, since so many of you are students, is also Governor Murphy just signed the professional licensing legislation, which basically allows for folks to obtain a professional license here in New Jersey, regardless of status, which is great because many of you might have students, classmates who are getting their degrees at Rutgers, who are trying to see what they're going to do after college. And many of them before this law weren't going to be able to get their nursing license, their teacher's license, their social services licenses, because the state had a law that required citizenship for that. And that is no longer needed. So it's a great progress, and it's just good for us to know the progress we've made in the state as well, so that folks can know what resources they have available to them as well.
That is so relevant, Joanna. Thank you so much for sharing that information. Just one final question before I open it up to the floor. Are we going to see the driver licenses for all on January 1st, or is COVID going to impact the rollout of that driver license?
Well, yeah, so I'm not, I honestly will say, I don't know what the timeline looks like for our motor vehicles agency. They're the ones really leading on the implementation. We're working closely with them on ensuring that we have outreach plans and that our community gets the information that they need in the language that they need, and that we do everything we can to ensure that people know what the requirements will be, where to go, and that at least we prevent fraud. So all those things are on our priority list right now. But I don't know in terms of timeline that is for the motor vehicles to let us know.
Yeah, well, thank you. I know they've had their challenges.
Yes.
I appreciate you sharing your wisdom, your experience as an advocate, and we're so thrilled to see you as the founding director of the Office of New Americans. At this point, are there any questions from the audience? Susanna, is there anything in the chat?
Yes.
If there's nothing, I know Joanna's going to stick around. We're going to think about your questions. We'll have an opportunity at the end for more questions, and I'll turn it back to Ray. Thank you again, Joanna.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. That was a really great overview of the importance of policy for not just Hispanics, but for the populations in New Jersey, and a really good overview for social work students. So you'll have to come back and talk to some of our policy classes about some of the work you're doing. It's really interesting. Next, I'd like to introduce Gloria Lopez-Henriquez. She's a bilingual and bicultural psychotherapist. She has extensive experience working with families and couples from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. She's adjunct faculty at the School of Social Work, consultant with the Princeton Board of Education Diversity Committee. She designed and managed a program for unaccompanied minors in Princeton. She also maintains a private practice as well. She's a board member of the Latino Action Network Foundation. She's also on the faculty of the Ackerman Institute for Families in New York City. And she's also a graduate of the DSW program here at Rutgers. So one of our great alums. So welcome. And I'd like to ask you some questions, Dr. Lopez-Henriquez.
Thank you, Dr. Sanchez. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. Okay, your experience as a social worker, psychotherapist, trainer, and professor is extensive, working with many different types of individuals in the Latino community. Can you share some of the personal experiences that have led you to take this path and what encourages you to continue to take on difficult challenges, such as your work with processing extreme hardship evaluations? And for some people who don't know what that is, maybe you can explain.
Okay, extreme hardship evaluations are, when I explain it to people, usually they say, do you have to really prove that? So there are clinical reports based on the family's story, where I have to prove that the separation of the families, usually the parents, you know, sending the family to their country of origin because they are documented, would horribly affect emotionally the children. So when I say that to people, they said, and you have to prove that? And I said, yes. That's part of the whole process. So there's two personal experiences that I can name. The first one is that coming to this country, I came as a young adult. I had never, a sense of loss had never left me. I have always carried this loss of what I knew before I came. And actually working with families, especially Latino families, gives me that sense of home. So there's a selfish reason why I adore this job. The second one is that since I came, I have really struggled to locate myself racially in a country that talk racially just about Black and white. And so everybody who's like me in the middle of, you know, these two different races, it's really confusing to find your place. So, but little by little, I have been finding that place, and it has been an important discovery. So I am a mestiza who's light skinned, who's also educated. I have never been undocumented. I speak the language. I live in white neighborhoods most of my time. I attended white universities most of my time. So I have come to a very privileged position where I have access to white important places. At the same time, I have access to the Latino community. I think that dual access to both community put me in a very special place where I can go back and forth and do my best job because I can do the two things. So part of me writing these extreme hardship evaluations is to put the stories of the families that I meet and interview, the stories of strength, the stories of suffering, the stories of perseverance in a language of clinical terms that the court understands and can see how this, you know, removal of parents may or partners may impact their families. So that's exactly what I do. So it's a little bit of, and that's something else that has happened across the time, and is that I wanted to include or integrate my role as an activist into my role as a clinician. And I think that this is the perfect marriage. I can do that. So those two experiences kind of have driven me to what I do.
LISTA's aim, as you know, is to increase the number of social workers who are culturally competent or culturally sensitive to provide services to Latino populations. Can you share some of your experiences working with different Latino populations and the importance of being culturally sensitive?
I think that I can talk about that for 3 months, no stopping, and I probably would like more time, but we don't have that much time. So the first one would be that informal and formal conversations about cultural competence. I have always been very taken by the fact that race is usually outside that conversation. And I think that the lens of race is a very effective tool to look at micro and micro dynamics in the Latino community. So at the macro, the people who presented before me actually gave you the perfect picture, So, but it is pretty much what all that most people have seen, and that now research is kind of proving that the dark, and not just here in the United States, but across Latin American countries, that the darker you are, the access to services, to opportunities is a lot less. So that's not just here, but it's also in Latin America. So I think that we need to look at that and be conscious of that, because if we don't look at our community as a diverse racially community and ethnically, we're not going to be of much help. But at the micro level, when I work as a clinician, race continued to be an issue in some of the difficulties that immigrant families present. One of the biggest ones is about colorism that is present in many of the conflicts between siblings, many of the conflicts between family members. And if we don't provide a language, a way to talk about these things in the society, we have to be the ones starting these conversations in the smaller places where people feel a little more comfortable, but you need to be savvy and experienced to do this, and instead of doing something that works for the family and not to harm the family. So I think that we need a lot of learning to do in this area. Something else that I believe that we need to do is that the immigration story is a incredible place to start talking about immigration. But most of the families that I know, most of the Latino families that I see, they're mixed studies families. And so how we can talk about how these different studies affect the family dynamics, who's in, who's out, who has more power. Those are things that change, for example, the dynamics between parents and children, when children are more powerful in a lot of ways than parents. But I always, at the same time, I'm always very incredibly, greatly surprised of how parents hold their power as parents, even though those situations are given. But not all parents are able to do that. So that's something that we need to do. And between partners, one that is documented and the other one is undocumented, or aunts and uncles who are documented or not documented in the family. So I think that we need to be able to ask those questions, but wait for the family to give us the okay to enter those conversations. I don't think that we need to impose them. We need to just create that possibility for them to tell me. And the other piece that I don't see pretty often is that we need to ask questions about adapting to this country in a different way. We always think that things like how many years you have been here, or how much English or Spanish would determine how adapted you are to this country. And I think that we miss the question of how you feel that you have adapted. So many people who have been here for years don't feel that they have adapted to the country. And we need to explore that with a lot more details, because I think that impacts your mental health directly. Feeling out as an outsider forever, for all of your life. And so we need to ask those questions. So that's pretty much what I have for that question.
Okay. I think we just have time for one more question, and we'll have some open up for other questions. We know that you worked with unaccompanied minors in the past. What were some of the most pressing clinical and systemic issues the youth faced that you worked with?
I've learned by writing the hardship evaluations that unaccompanied minors have been coming to the States for decades, but now they're getting the attention. But they have been here for many, many decades. So when I find out about undocumented unaccompanied minors was when I started to work at the school in Princeton. And so it was a group of kids, about 50, mostly boys in their teens, who came from Central America by themselves. And Princeton took them in and were part of their school system, the high school. So these kids were at different levels educationally. Some of them didn't even know how to read or write, and other kids were at grade level. So the challenge of the school to be able to educate them at the same time, and kids who were 16, 17, some of them were over 18. So it was the school, how a school can provide education at the individual level for all these children. So that was one of the things that I saw first, how the schools were unprepared actually to provide academic services for these children. The second one was that, and I think that this is the biggest, especially for them, was that they came from families and countries where they had the freedom and the power to say, I'm going to go by myself crossing that border, and I'm going to be working in the United States and making money and saving and helping your family. So sometimes the resources of the whole family and sometimes the community came together to pay that trip. And so these kids felt totally responsible to work as hard as they can to be able to pay the promises. But when they came and they were caught at the border and they were put under the supervision of the state, then their freedom to do what they needed to do to pay their dues couldn't happen. So many of them were very upset about this vision of them as children and not as the adults that they felt they were. So they complain about that. They didn't complain about anything else, working many, many hours, going to school, not having friends. They didn't complain about that. They complain about being seen as children. So that's part of what I saw. But one thing that I learned from the older unaccompanied minors that I meet now, that they're 20, 30, 40 years old, is what they tell me is that at that point when I crossed the border, nobody stopped me. So they were able to come and work, no problem. But they see now how they didn't have the time to become adults, that they became adults when they were 16. And then now they don't want their children to have the same thing. So that's what I have learned with that program at Princeton High School.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes, we do have a question for Dr. Lopez-Henriquez. And this question is from Dr. Melinda Contreras-Bird. She says, thank you for those important facts regarding the struggles of the Latinx family here in the US. Thank you also for acknowledging the critical issue of race and colorism that operates both within our families and communities, as well as the cultures of the US. This factor greatly informs the life experiences for a portion of the Latinx community worldwide. You know what, I apologize, that was not a question. I do, however, have a question. So this is from Professor Christine Morales, and this is actually for the panel. My students often ask me, how do I get involved? With your experiences in organizing and activism, how can energized individuals not yet engaged in action identify groups to align with, particularly during a time of COVID and competing demands on attention created by social media?
Joanna or Gloria, I don't know if Juan is still here. Anybody want to answer that?
I think that my immediate sort of gut feeling is really connecting locally, finding what's going on in your community, and connecting also on ways that fit what you're interested in. Because I think volunteering your time and jumping into this work can be really draining. It's a lot of work to join activism and social justice issues. And so it's about just jumping into something that matters to you, whether that is social work, whether that is self-care, whether that is mental health, whether that is food accessibility, or whether that is rallies, marches, protests, etc. I think it's just finding that niche that fits what you are interested in, and then figuring out a way to plug in. Check out what's going on locally. You'll be surprised. I think there are plenty of organizations and service providers who are trying to figure out what to do. And while social media, there's a ton going on in social media, sometimes social media is where a lot of these groups organize and gather, because they are not these super mega large organizations. They're super hyper local. They use Facebook to tell folks when they're having events, and organizers have gotten really creative on how to get together through COVID. So I think it's just seeing what's going on locally and then plugging in.
Yeah, if I can add also on that, I would second what Johanna has said. You know, my wife and I have been here in New Brunswick now only for about 4 years, but we sort of got involved directly with the local community here when we were invited to a school board meeting over this issue of the Lincoln Annex Public School that RWJ and the Rutgers Cancer Institute want to demolish to expand their health facilities. And we ended up connecting with all of these folks in the largely, as many of you probably know, the New Brunswick is over 50% Latino, mostly Mexican and Central American. And so we ended up getting involved with a bunch of the local groups here, New Labor, Cosecha, and others who were beginning to organize around this issue. But then when the COVID pandemic hit, we realized that the school was important. Saving the school was an important issue, but saving people at that point was even bigger. So we ended up creating a mutual aid group in New Brunswick, and we did a GoFundMe campaign within a few weeks, largely from Rutgers professors and other contacts. We were able to raise $23,000 and then provided cash grants to undocumented residents of New Brunswick, and we were able to get grants of $300 to $500 within a few weeks directly to families. Before in New Jersey, or because there was no stimulus, there was no extra unemployment benefits for the undocumented, but we were able to build a quick network and connect with all of these families on an issue that we hadn't started out. We had started out over the school, but that's been able to build all these connections, and it's right here in New Brunswick, blocks away from the campus of Rutgers. It's just that sometimes we don't see the immediate community around our universities as an area where we can provide some assistance.
I would like to say, because I'm mostly a therapist, that it would be, before jumping into help, I think that it needs to be a reflection about what is motivating you to move and to do things. And I think that we need to be clear about those motivations. Because sometimes when you're not clear, you believe that because you're in a location of more power, that you can go there and initiate movements that probably other people have already done. And probably you need to go there and just to be there to be told what to do? And that's a question that we need to ask ourselves. I want to help at any level, and I'm okay with other people leading the way. So I will recommend that.
Good. Any other questions?
Yes,
Susan?
yes, we had one question from earlier also for Joanna. And this question is from Lauren Whitfield. She says, Joanna, thank you for your talk and work. My question is, in your experience, have you come across any scholarly journals or research that you would recommend about the experiences of children of undocumented parents in schools?
In schools, a little bit tougher. I've seen some data on how many, I know that we heard from Gloria about the mixed status families, and there's a lot of research on how many of the dreamers, undocumented youth, and what they are dealing with mixed status families, how many of them might be sometimes, especially now that DACA exists, right? They might be the only ones that have a driver's license, a work permit, et cetera, and they become the lifeline to their families who may not have their status. So I've seen some from Migration Policy Institute that has some information on that. New American Economy has put out some information as well. I don't know about any others. I'm sure there are books out. I mean, I know when I was in college, we were reading books about the experience of so many of immigrants that came to this country and their undocumented experience, but I couldn't tell you anything that's more specifically about schooling and their experiences in schools.
Mm. Maybe Gloria knows some.
Yeah, I don't know if the other folks know better than I on that.
The Pew Charitable Trust as well has lots of information that's available regarding our population.
Yes, I actually, when I write the evaluations, usually add a list of references to the literature to back up my argument. So if anybody's interested, I can send you the list.
Okay, maybe Lauren can get that list of references for you. I just wanted to mention something, if there are no more questions, something, well, two things Gloria said I thought were interesting on the micro level. One of them had to do with colorism, which I don't think there is some literature, but we don't talk enough about in the Latino community. And I know from my own experience, you know, you have a family with a rainbow of colors, but if you are very light-skinned like me and somebody else in my family, my brother is not, we have two different experiences, though, because of the way that people respond to us based on, you know, skin color. That's one thing, that thing about the colorism and how that is an issue in therapy. And the other one, I think that is important, not just from a clinical point of view, but also from a research point of view, which has to do with how that people adapt to this country in different ways. And it doesn't matter how long they've been here. As researchers, sometimes we try to use proxies for things like acculturation. And so one of them is length of time. We assume the longer a person is here, the more acculturated they're going to be. And that's not always true. You could go to Calle Ocho in Miami, and there's people there who never learned English, who live in a cocoon that's all Cuban, and they're not acculturated at all. And that's true for some other places where there's these ethnic enclaves. And I think that's a really important distinction in terms of when you're dealing with a family in therapy. But I really like the range of speakers and the thing from history and politics, macro level policy and micro level clinical, as well as Dr. Padilla's more of an educational approach. I want to thank, well, Elsa and I want to thank all of you for coming. We want to thank President Holloway, Dean Potter, our speakers, Juan Gonzalez, Drolanda Padilla, Joanna Calle, and Gloria Lopez-Henriquez. We also want to acknowledge the work of those who made this possible, who helped us out. Associate Dean Laura Curran, Zachary Thomas, Madison Molnar, Karen Crimmins, and Susan Moro Misato. Thank you all. Mil gracias.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.